Great. Thank you. I'm conscious we're running slightly late, so I might have to talk quickly.
We can always go into coffee.
Thank you. But that shouldn't be a problem because my slides are available online. And I'm also recording this talk. I'm also hopefully live streaming this talk and videoing this talk and the like. And so this can help make this talk, hopefully if it works, more accessible to other people who might be watching remotely, but also if you want to digest this in your own time. I should say though, when I say these slides are available online, it's PowerPoint. The images on these slides, they don't have alt tags, you know, so I have taken a decision, a risk decision. Now, I don't think it would be reasonable for me to put alt tags in all of those images. And I suspect that might be the same for the other speakers here. So sometimes we don't always follow the WCAG guidelines. And so my talk will be about the holistic approaches, which a group of primarily UK-based accessibility researchers and practitioners have been involved in for about the past 7 years. And how, when I discovered BS 8878, I thought that is so much relates to the work that we've been doing. So many thanks to Jonathan and other colleagues. So a bit about me, web evangelist, doing websites since 1993, speaker at various papers on web accessibility. And I was at the launch of WAY, which was in Santa Clara in 1997. And what I'll be doing is I'll be telling a story in this talk about how things have developed since the initial enthusiasm I felt for the WAY approach, then a discovery of some of the limitations of the approach, ways in which we sought to address the limitations, and how I think these approaches that we've been looking at relate to BS 8878. So you'll all be familiar with WAY, WCAG, UAG, and ATAG. So a model based upon 3 components, simple to grasp. But the question I asked back in 2005 when I gave this slide was, is it simplistic? Is it oversimplistic? Does it model the complexities of the real world, the diversities of the way the web is being used, even more diverse now, and some of the real world technical challenges, but also cultural and political and economic challenges as well. So back in 2005, when WCAG 1 was live, we were saying there were problems with the model. It required support for all different components. What if until user agent support? And this is what if people are using Internet Explorer 6, because that doesn't support the best practices. And guess what? How many people have IE6 in their organization now? Yep. So we're still in the world that those user agents still aren't there in terms of in the user environment. So real world complexities. So was there a plan B, or is it this is the only true way and we must follow it? And then there were the questions about the specifics of WCAG 1.0 limitations. So these were the limitations which we were describing in 2005. And we might say, well, we've got a new WCAG, it doesn't matter anymore. Except in Germany and in Ireland, I googled this morning, legislation still requires conformance with WCAG 1.0. So this flawed thing. And I suspect in Ireland, they've got more pressing problems than updating their accessibility legislation. Because legal systems do not change, the political environment doesn't change at the same rate as the technical environment. So there's this mismatch. Now this is nitpicking. WCAG is valuable. I agree, it is valuable. It's a valuable set of guidelines, but the problem is when we try and push them too far, where we're not honest about the limitations of those guidelines. So I was concerned that some of the limitations might be exposed, taken to a court of law, and point out that the RNIB website doesn't comply with WCAG guidelines. I don't know if that's still the case, but it didn't used to. So there was that mismatch between the theoretical framework and a real-world environment. So that's all the negative side of things, and I know Shadi has heard these things before on a number of occasions. But we weren't just negative. We said, okay, so what should we do? What advice should we be giving, particularly to those working in higher and further education? And so our first paper, we looked at a holistic framework for e-learning accessibility. And we said the important thing isn't the accessibility of the e-learning resource, it's the accessibility of the learning experience. The resource is just there to help the learning process. And so maybe there can be alternative ways of providing those type of solutions. And this morning you heard from Andy about the Access for All, which was talking about these alternative variants. So e-learning isn't just about the web. There's a whole set of other technological solutions, and there's also another set of real-world approaches. The important thing is the accessibility of the learning outcomes. And the things we were saying very much fitted in with, as Jonathan said, UK legislation which talks about reasonable measures. It doesn't say every PowerPoint file on your university website must have alt tags on their images. It says talking about reasonable measures. And that is really great because it's technologically neutral. It doesn't have the problems with the flaws in WCAG, which are now agreed. Everybody knows that. And it's forward-looking and backwards-looking, and acknowledges the difference between the different providers of the services. What might be applicable for Google to do is not necessarily the case for a small charitable organisation with limited resources and technical expertise. And we said, well, universal access, how could you possibly knock that? Or the content must be understandable. Must content always be understandable? So, can anybody tell me the differences between these two? So if you were, actually Terry, if you were asking a medical student, you might say, what can you tell me about these? And it's, oh well, that's an animal cell and that's a human cell. And I go, no, why do you think that? It might be, one's a healthy cell and the other's a cancerous cell. And I would go, that's right. And so which is which? And it might be, well, that'll be the healthy one because that's nice and round. Actually. And I'd say, well, explain that. And you might say, but on the other hand, or you might talk to your colleagues and you might decide that actually it's the other one is the normal cell and you understand the reasons why. So the understanding isn't a product of the resource in a learning context. The understanding happens through some learning process. It might be we construct our knowledge based upon our discussion with other people, our previous learning. So this notion of understanding doesn't necessarily work in a learning context or a cultural context. What does that do to you? What does that photo do to you? Now, Mona Lisa, we'll all be familiar with the Mona Lisa, but what about this Salvador Dali painting? Can anybody understand this? Can anybody tell me what it's about? So if you can't see it, I can provide you with some factual information about it. By Salvador Dali, painted in 1929. The title is The Great Masturbator. What does that mean in terms of understanding what it's about? There's a context to understanding art. And then we have what's this? What do you see? And that's a visual trickery. Is it a duck or is it a rabbit? And it's the joy that you find when it's revealed to you is the thing. And this is going back, I think it relates very nicely to Jonathan's comments about his Pac-Man games, about the pleasure. You're thinking about the experience that you want to provide, not necessarily about just the understanding. And we can look at this question about universal accessibility in other dimensions. So there's a famous Second Life video in which a user with cerebral palsy was saying how great she found use of Second Life, because she might be in a wheelchair in her home, but using Second Life she can interact with other people. So we might say it's not universally accessible, you're not allowed to use it. That would be the danger if one's organisational policies said that everything must be universally accessible to everyone. This is the problem. And this is developed by Jane Seal when she was at Southampton University. And again, Jonathan mentioned this about the need to ensure that accessibility wasn't just hijacked by the techies. It needed to be bundled in. We need to get the other stakeholders, the quality assessment units, the learning technologists, all of these different things. And all of you within your own context, I think Jonathan's context, his stakeholder model, was about producers. It was a BBC view of the world. This is a learning view of the world. Each of you will have a different set of models of your stakeholders related to what your core service is. So we might say our service is the learning service or the research service. So back in 2007, when the 2.0 meme was popular, we coined the term Accessibility 2.0. In a way, we regarded this as the bazaar, the supporting a diversity of experiences rather than the cathedral, the monolithic approach of WCAG, which took about many years for version 2.0 to come along. Because accessibility is hard, and we don't know all the answers. We don't even know what accessibility is. There are lots of different definitions of accessibility. So we're saying it's hard, there's not a single solution. We need to be flexible. We need to support a diversity of approaches to addressing accessible issues, and that diversity might also include real-world issues. It might be we can make this talk accessible by recording it on an iPod Touch, recording it on a flip or streaming it. I'm being reasonable here. These are consumer products that we can do to enhance the accessibility. We've actually done this with Jane Seal when she missed a train, and we use Skype in order for her to participate in a meeting. It's using the tools that are readily available. And the other thing about our approach was we felt it had to be scalable. And there's a problem here that the approach, the WCAG approach, I think, will only work if you're carefully handcrafting each individual resource with tender loving care. My PowerPoint slides have got so many images on them. I'm not going to put all the alt tags on those images. And if you think about that, the numbers of web resources, the number of resources with the URI these days, 2 million emails per second, you know, how many tweets per second, all of these things. We need to have a scalable solution. Thank you. And so, I can recall it was EA probably said, not quite so bluntly, that rhetoric is fine, Brian, but how does it mean in terms of what should I do? Which was a good question. So what we did, don't know if this was a paper you contributed to, but this was a repositories, institution repository of all of those researchers in our universities beavering away and producing a PDF. And that PDF is put in our repository to make it openly accessible for the research community. How many of those authors do you think make sure that the images in their PDFs have alt tag? A very small number. We've actually done a bit of research. That's not going to happen. So the question was, what do you do about your institutional repository? Well, quite clearly you had to shut down your institutional repository because you've got a university policy which says all resources must be WCAG AA. And WCAG 2 makes it clear it talks about PDFs and not just native web resources. And that's plainly silly. So what we kind of needed was a way that can encompass such complexities. And so this is where we were talking about putting the user first to say, the way we were, the rule says that all government websites must be WCAG AA conformant. Sadly, we had a meeting, an accessibility summit at TechDisc, and we all said, no, that is not what we wanted. But that's what came out at the end. So they're the rules, and then, you know, that constrains what you're doing. So what we said, no, you put the user first, you have the various processes that Jonathan was talking about, and then you seek to see how the accessibility rules may be applied within that context. So putting the user first. And so this is what we called, this was thanks to Liddy Neville, a talk I gave over in Australia, when she was talking about web adaptability. There was this tension, what is accessibility, what is usability? Maybe we need to coin a new phrase. So we looked at the term web adaptability, in which we were saying, and I think, Jonathan, this might relate quite nicely. It might be seen to try and do the mapping with BS 8, 8, 7, 8, looking at the audiences, the importance of policies. Resources are a real issue, particularly today's economic climate. The definition, what is the purpose of your service, the things that innovation might come along. So you make your inaccessible resource, you record your inaccessible resource today, put it on YouTube, because they'll do something clever like the auto-captioning and the like. So it might be that you create inaccessible resources today, because if you don't, it's a problem for accessibility in the future. And that needed to be wrapped around this issue of the reasonable measures. And that reasonable measures would be within the context, the cultural context, the legal framework. So you might say, oh, well, I've decided that due to the resources, blah, 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 it's only going to work in Internet Explorer. And that wouldn't be reasonable. We know that, the browser-specific websites. So this is the reasonable measure needs to be done within that type of context. And Jonathan was quite right to say you don't list what all of those things are. It's kind of society decides what those things should be in conjunction with one's peers. And on Friday, it dawned on me that another view of the way model is this grammatical model. All people understand or perceive resources. And what Way have done, the model is very much about looking at the resource, the best practices for the resource, the tools for creating the resource, and the tools for viewing the resource. So it's all over here. The verb is understand and perceive, and the people is everybody. It's universally accessible to everybody. And I'm saying, nope, perhaps what we want to do is to say, rethink about the verb. This Pac-Man game is there to entertain me. This teenage website is to annoy me. You know, it might be that people are teenagers, you know, teenage kids are creating there used to be MySpace websites which were in black and as full of existential angst. It wasn't universally accessible to everyone. It was part of, you know, their community. And the web, in many respects, is supporting that type of community. So it's about, I think, I've started to do some thinking about what do we mean by these type of verbs that are more than just understand. So John learns from the web resource, but Jill might learn from a real-world alternative because that reflects her personal preferences. Now, what does that mean in real life? Well, a few years ago, I gave a talk at somebody gave a talk at a public library event at Bath, and they were saying, oh, we created this flash game, it was for kids, oh, the kids really loved it. And I put my hand up and said, so what about the new sender legislation that was about to come in? And oh, yeah, well, we'll have to take it down. And I go, no. You say the kids, oh, yeah, they really love it. So what's it for? And the purpose of the game was when the parents come in, they want to dump the kids somewhere for 10 minutes so they could browse the books, put them in front of this game. And I said, what about a bouncy castle? It's equivalent. It provides an equivalent experience. I gave that talk once, and people says, but you couldn't have a bouncy castle in a library, it'd be too noisy. Perhaps not a transferable example. But this was the kind of thing that there can be equivalent physical surrogates for an inaccessible resource. And then some other examples within a cultural heritage. There was the Tate award-winning IMAP project, and this was to introduce the works of Matisse and Picasso to visually impaired users. Clearly defined target audience. It wasn't to everybody, it was to a particular set of target audiences. And what did they do? They used Flash. This was when Flash was outrageous back in those days, and they were using Flash so that press the space bar and you could see the marks, the brush strokes and the like. So it was providing that type of interaction which was felt to be particularly relevant for that user community. And it was a blended approach as well, so there were the raised images and there was the Braille type output. So I thought that was a great example of that holistic approach being used in a cultural heritage context for a particular target audience. Another good example was Wolverhampton Art Gallery, in which they were providing signing, and again, the approach that they were taking was to have the deaf users involved in the design type processes. So that was, we felt, an important part of the approach. So, of course, I know Shadi will say, Shadi's heard this talk before, and say, yes, I agree with a lot of this. And it's true, a lot of these things are in harmony with the WCAG approaches and the WCAG developments. And so many of the flaws have been, in version 1, have been addressed. But we feel there's still a need for contextualization. And what we hadn't had previously was a type of standard for that contextualization. And I think this is what the BS 8878 Code of Practice does. It provides an agreed template for saying, yes, when is this reasonable, when is this not reasonable? Because there are also other accessibility standards works going on. You know, it doesn't just happen within W3C. So Adobe are doing their best practices for PDFs. Microsoft done a lot of good work both on the operating system level and on the various Office formats. We've heard about Access for All. We've also got the library standard, the Mark 21. So you want a book, but you want an audio format. Now, do you want the audio as a cassette or an MP3? And what digitisation of the MP3? So there will be variances happening there. So there will be the work that Andy has spoken about in Access for All in context, and there'll be similar work that's happening within a library world. And some of those things will be applicable to different audiences. The Access for All work won't have any significant impact, I feel, to those who are involved in library vendors and OPAC systems. Now, conscious there's only a few moments left. So this was the work that we were doing, and we were conscious that we got real buy-in from much of the accessibility practitioners and researchers and the user community, the educational people in the UK, but also in Australia. We had some links with Australia. And we set up two accessibility summits held at JISC CETIS, in which we got buy-in from people like Kevin Carey and Robert Christopherson, with saying what we don't want is some highly specific WCAG checkpoints to do. It needs to be this type of more inclusive approach. But we weren't really having the impact. This was just a group of researchers and other people, the policy makers within institutions, were saying, what's the standard here, and going out. So that was when I saw the first draft of BS 8878, and I thought, oh, this is great, this is really, really good. I must try and get a copy of the final version, because I don't know if it's changed much since that draft. But anyway, so, and I saw the webinar that was held, I think, the day after the official launch, so a lot of my views were based upon that webinar, which I understand was not necessarily an official one, but it was about getting away from the rut of technical guidelines. And I don't need to go through about it because Jonathan has covered all of these things. But I was thinking, it's 13, which is the WCAG guidelines. And yeah, they're important, but not as important as the bigger context. So for me, it's this bigger context which is really important, not just that specific thing. So, so going back to our most recent paper, we were saying this, and I wonder what, again, to the extent at which maps directly to BS 8878, it was the reasonable measures. Part of the reasonable measures are the costs it takes to implement things, provision of alternatives, just-in-time accessibility, rather than the just-in-case, the importance of advocacy, education and training, and the need to share those type of case studies about how what's the best way of doing accessibility for institutional repositories. I don't know, I've put some suggestions up, but we need to share them and to discuss them. Engagement with users with disabilities, and to focus on accessibility rather than web accessibility. That for me is an important thing. So I've said there's some handouts, by the way, of a draft briefing paper which goes in, people want a copy afterwards, goes into the example of institutional repositories, what you might do, and a similar thing for amplified events, streaming and making use of Wi-Fi networks. So I think we now have that understanding of the limitations of the one-size-fits-all approach, and how the research community and the standards community within BS 8878 have seemed to be closely harmonised. And I know various people involved in that standard were aware of the various papers we produced. So I think some of the challenges are, and I think, again, this is echoing what Jonathan said about, we're still at an early stage. I was really pleased when Jonathan didn't say, we've got this standard, this code of practice, and it's solved everything. He says, we want to test it, we want to see if it works, and if it doesn't work, we want to throw it away. And I think that's an important lesson that we do need to learn. And I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Now, does anyone have any questions for Brian?